Welcome to the seventh in the Pillars of Democracy series sponsored by the Library of Congress in partnership with the American Enterprise Institute and the Brookings Institution. I'm John Haskell, former director of the John W. Kluge Center at the Library of Congress. We live in a challenging time. Polls show that major institutions in American society, both in government and in civic life, are less trusted and less respected than at any time in living memory. In an effort to grapple with the question of how their decline can be counteracted, we're bringing together historians, political scientists, legal scholars, authors, and practitioners from across the ideological spectrum. The idea is to create a fuller picture of the challenges facing American institutions as well as their potential promise. Last month, we looked at electoral institutions. Today we consider the US military, something of an outlier as it retains a higher level of public trust than any other governmental institution. But that doesn't mean it has been removed from the larger trends. The armed forces have been at the center of struggles for equality around race, gender, sexual orientation, and gender identity. And high-profile events like foreign deployments and the withdrawal from Afghanistan continue to shape public perceptions of the military, even introducing some of the polarized partisanship and distrust that have defined other institutions. Today's conversation will be moderated by William Galston, who holds the Ezra K. Zilkha Chair in the Brookings Institution's Governance Studies program. He's taught at the University of Maryland School of Public Policy and served as the Deputy Assistant for Domestic Policy under President Clinton. He's the author of 9 books, most recently Anti-Pluralism, The Populist Threat to Liberal Democracy, and he writes a regular column for the Wall Street Journal. Our panelists today include Kori Schake, a senior fellow and the director of foreign and defense policy studies at the American Enterprise Institute. Before joining AEI, Dr. Schake was the deputy director general of the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London. She's had a distinguished career in government, working at the State Department, the Department of Defense, and the National Security Council. Joe Capello is Chief Human Capital Officer for the Library of Congress. He previously served at the Department of Justice, where he was the Assistant Director of the department's Administration and Oversight Group. Prior to entering the Federal Civilian Service, Joe had a distinguished 22-year career in the U.S. Air Force. We're also joined by Vincent K. Brooks. He's a career Army officer who retired from active duty in January 2019 as the 4-star general in command of all U.S. forces in Korea, where he concurrently commanded United Nations Command, as well as the Republic of Korea U.S. Combined Forces Command, comprising over 650,000 Koreans and Americans under arms. General Brooks, who goes by Vince, is a 1980 graduate of the United States Military Academy at West Point, the first class to include women, and he led the 4,000 cadets as the Cadet Brigade Commander or First Captain. Please note that we're leaving time for questions at the end of the conversation in about 45 minutes. You may submit your questions to the moderator through the chat function on Zoom. We appreciate it if your questions uphold the spirit of respectful and civil discourse. Thank you so much for tuning in. Bill, it's all yours.
Thanks, John. I should just add one piece to my biography, which will demonstrate that I'm the low man on the totem pole for this conversation. We have a 4-star general with us, a lieutenant colonel, a renowned expert on military studies, and then there's me. I was a sergeant in the U.S. Marine Corps during the Vietnam era, so I will salute everybody on this panel as appropriate.
You have that pyramid inverted, Bill. The sergeant's at the top of it.
Yep.
Saluting you back.
So let me just tee up our conversation. Let me start by saying how pleased I am that all of the panelists were able to join us today. We had schedule issues, technical issues, but somehow it's all working out. There is a traditional Washington discussion about the military. And it revolves around extremely important questions. Does the military have the personnel that it needs? Does it have the equipment, the weaponry that it needs? Does it have the leaders that it needs? Does it have the right strategy to fit the challenges that we face abroad and to defend the security of the United States. These are the sorts of questions that are debated appropriately so in Congress, among oversight committees, committees dealing with authorizations and appropriations, etc. We're going to have a different conversation today because this is a panel series dealing with the fundamental building blocks. We call them, for purpose of this series, the pillars of American democracy, the pillars of our constitutional order. And the military, we believe, which is why we're having this panel, is one of those key pillars. And so the question on the floor for the next hour and a half or so, how well is the military performing its appropriate institutional role as a key pillar of our constitutional democracy? Are the various aspects of the military that bear on its institutional responsibility in the constitutional democracy, are those in good working order? Or are there some problems that we need to attend to? Let me begin with a classic issue, and I'm going to call on Vince Brooks to answer it first, and then the rest of the panel will join in. The issue is civil-military relations. We have a long tradition in this country of civilian control of the armed forces. It has been challenged from time to time. President Lincoln had some problems with it during the Civil War, and he was finally resorted to sending a telegram, as I recall, to one of his generals to the effect that if you don't want to use your army, may I borrow it for a while? And of course, there was the famous episode in the early 1950s when Douglas MacArthur, General Douglas MacArthur, challenged the authority of Harry Truman to direct our military strategy in Korea and was fired. In general, I think most people think that civilian control of the armed forces is alive and well, but some glitches have emerged very recently. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, found himself in the middle of the infamous events in Lafayette Park in the middle of 2020 in full military fatigues. The command structure on January 6th, the relationship between the different elements of the military forces and the civilian leadership turned out to be ramshackle and to some extent non-functional. And there are issues involving, I believe, the participation of retired military leaders in politics. So with that as a prelude, starting with you, Vince Brooks, what is your assessment of the current state of civil-military relations?
Well, first, let me say thanks to you and to the whole team here, to the library, and to the co-sponsors for inviting me to participate in what is a very important topic to discuss. Certainly, it's a contemporary issue, but not a new one. I would say, Bill, to answer your question, at least to begin to respond to it, I think we're still in good shape. Now, having said that, there's imperfection, as you talked about, and there has always been imperfection in the civil-military relationship. And for one point, I would say is that the understanding of the civil-military relationship continues to drift. It has throughout our history. What does that mean? Does that mean that a general who doesn't get the supplies that he needs can go straight to the Congress and say, I want the supplies, and get those procured directly by the Congress around the White House? Well, that's happened in our history, particularly the 1800s. Some of those same people who got letters about using the army were known for such behaviors. Was that okay? is that reinforcing what the Constitution says about the role that Congress plays over the military? To be able to go and get the direct procurement? At the time, that was okay for a while, and then it wasn't. And at the present time, it's definitely not okay. How much should military leaders comment on the production of policy? I did a study when I was a fellow at the Kennedy School some years ago, and had interviews with several practitioners of the national security art, shall we say, and tried to get an understanding of what should that relationship be in the formulation of policy. What should the appropriate civil-military relationship be? And my colleagues and I, who did the research, each from a different service, having talked to these practitioners, arrived at the view that there needs to be a constructive collaboration to yield the best policy. And that is to say that there's not a senior subordinate relationship in the formulation of policy. There's a collaborative relationship where several ideas need to be brought to bear. And the idea of military advice being something that's purely about the technical aspects of military advice, that too is one issue that has fluctuated over time. Is that what the military advice is about? Or is it the collection of the experiences of those few people who get to sit inside of the highest levels of government policymaking and provide the full scope of their understanding, their world experiences, the things that they've undertaken, the fact that they may have been through certain options before and the consequences of them? That too has fluctuated over time. Should the military have comment in that, or just execute the policy that's given to them? I do think that we still struggle with what that ultimately manifests into. When a military operation appears to have gone poorly, is that on the military or is that on the civilian control? Clearly, the visibility is on the military. There's no doubt about that. And the military is strong enough and big enough to take that perspective of the public. It will have work to do to restore trust when that happens. Afghanistan is the most recent example of that, perhaps. But were they operating under constraints that were imposed as a matter of policy? Were they organized in a way that was directed to them? Were they staying out of things because that was the order given? Certainly, the view of military leaders would be to organize always in any undertaking that's being directed, and to plan for 3 or 4 others that have not been directed. The military as a culture over plans and over develops contingencies. It's unique within government in that regard. And sometimes that's burdensome in policy formulation. Well, not every piece of military advice is accepted. And nevertheless, the military is expected to implement the directives that have been given to them. So if there's a late decision, for example, on evacuating US nationals from a given location, like Afghanistan or like Ukraine or any other example you would like to pick, like Korea in my time there, if that decision is late, it doesn't change the circumstances for the military. You now have a compressed situation within which to operate, and you do the best you can with what you have. It may not be perfect, and it certainly won't match the way the military might have wanted to approach something like that. This is the nature of the civil-military relationship. Last thing I'll say on this, and because we'll certainly have plenty of chance to talk about it more, is what civilians are you talking about? I've experienced in my several tours in the Pentagon that the view of civil-military relationships is that nearly every civilian that's in any role has authority over the military, and that's questionable. That's questionable. There's a very clear line of command: the president, the secretary of defense, then to the combatant commanders. That's a very clear line of command. Control is a different point, though, and we're talking about civilian control of the military. Who is it that tells the military what they can and cannot do? And depending on a given administration and depending on the political zeitgeist at the time, I've seen that to be very, very intrusive, where nearly every civilian in any assistant position believes they have control. And then I've seen a much more collaborative approach to that as well. So it really varies depending on the zeitgeist. What is the continuity throughout that, though, is how we develop military officers with an expectation that when it's all said and done, they're going to take instructions appropriately. If they have concerns or reservation, they have ample opportunity to raise those. But once a decision is made by the legitimate decision makers, they're going to implement to the very best of their abilities. And that can lead to very difficult circumstances like Lafayette Square, or it can lead to difficult circumstances like January 6th of last year. These are difficult situations that the military often gets put in. There's a sacred trust that is involved in all of this. The military has access to and in many ways control over some very important instruments that protect democracy. Everything from White House communications to who's controlling the plane that the president is on at a given point in time. And that trust is that the military will never abuse that power to implement a change or a control because of what their obligations are and how they view their obligations professionally. But it is coupled with an expectation that there's a civilian aspect of this also, that there will never be a breach of the sacred trust that would put the military in a position where it would be compromised, where it would be used as a political instrument or for personal gain. And that's the conundrum. And then at the highest levels, like the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, it becomes then a matter of personal decision. I would say this applies to retired generals as well. If that is seen to have been breached, is there an obligation to comment on it, to alert fellow citizens about a concern that would potentially impact democracy? That's where I'll leave it at this point in time.
You've gotten us off to a fantastic start, and we're going to return to a number of the specific points that you made in the course of your remarks. Corey, over to you. How would you add to or qualify anything you've just heard?
So in my judgment, civil-military relations in the US are fundamentally sound and fundamentally healthy. And the main reason for that is actually the professionalism of our military itself. It's actually astonishing that in a time of such intensive political polarization in the United States, the American military is mostly able to stay out of it, despite efforts by both political parties to use the public respect for the military to political advantage. I think there are a number of historical examples of challenges to civil-military relations. You mentioned many of them, Bill. One that you didn't mention is one of my favorite examples, which is President Lincoln firing John C. Fremont, the military governor of Missouri, for declaring emancipation, which Lincoln understood would inflame warfare in the territories in the midst of the Civil War. And he needed to hold the political leadership of Missouri. Fremont was married to the daughter of Jesse Hart Benton, of Senator Benton. And she worked to drive up the cost to Lincoln of this choice. So it's not new for the American military to be dragged by politicians into the political space. And mostly the reason we can only think of a handful of examples is because of the excellent precedent of George Washington that our military stands in admiration of, and the strong professionalism of the American military about their subordination to the Constitution and their desperate desire to be left out of the political fights we have. One last point, you used the example of General Milley in Lafayette Square. And that was unquestionably a civil-military failure, right? The public didn't understand why he was in combat fatigues, marching with the president through a public space that had just been forcibly cleared of peaceful protesters. And General Milley clearly erred once he saw what was happening in not taking the Secretary of Defense aside and saying, hey boss, I don't think it's appropriate for me to be here. I'm pulling out. But I think he also strengthened civil-military relations in the aftermath with the video he recorded to be viewed by posterity as well as in its own time, emphasizing the mistakes he made, the subordination of the military to the Constitution, and the importance of military leaders staying out of the political fray. One last thing, I think I don't view the January 6th civil military issues the way you do, Bill, because it seems to me that they have to be seen in light of the military's mistakes during the civil justice protests the prior summer. Neither the elected political leaders in DC nor the military wanted to have the military at the front of handling the protests on January 6th. And most of the mistakes of January 6th were mistakes of reticence for military involvement, both by the elected leadership, by whom I mean the mayor of the district, and also by the military trying to stay out of it.
Thanks, Corey. Joe, you've had an opportunity to study these issues from a somewhat different vantage point. What would you say in response to my question?
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm glad Corey brought up the video that General Milley put out to all services after that event, because I really think it showcases from a military standpoint the seriousness of accountability and lessons learned throughout history that we're taught as military officers, members of the military. And for me, actually watching that video, that takes a lot to actually get on air and showcase that as a lesson in time. And I thought that was really important. So I appreciated Corey bringing that up. General Brooks brought up earlier that, the shape of our civilian military relationship is in good shape. And I would absolutely concur with that. My early time as an officer, you're actually trained quite well, in my opinion, whether it's in Squadron Officer School, Air Command and Staff, Air War College, all of our military education, the importance of civilian control and what that actually means. I actually had an opportunity when I was in a flying unit. My actual direct report was a civilian. It was quite interesting. That's who wrote my performance report. And later on in two of my assignments at the Pentagon, it was the exact same thing. I reported to civilians on the headquarters air staff. One of the other things I think I learned while I was at the Pentagon, and General Brooks brought this up a little bit earlier, there are political appointees throughout the Pentagon, from administration to administration. Doesn't matter if it's in policy, acquisitions, technology, logistics, and those political appointees and the interaction that you have as a military officer with those political appointees, whether it's in sessions on shaping policy, bringing forth courses of action for whether it's procurement for future military equipment, whether it's for wargaming scenarios, the like, there is an absolute relationship between military and civilian leaders within the Pentagon. It's extremely healthy. And at the end of the day, my experience as an officer was just that, bringing forward recommendation, courses of action. And at the end of the day, it was a decision made by a civilian in most cases where I was. I thought it was a very healthy relationship, and I think it's sustained today.
Terrific. So the verdict so far is that the basic structure of civil military relationships in the United States is in pretty good order, all things continued, all things considered, that there have been problems throughout our history, but that we've always been able to deal with them successfully, and that continues to be true up to the present day. Let me now shift to a somewhat different cut of the problem, and General Brooks, aka Vince, alluded to this in his opening remarks, and that is the military's appropriate role in policy debates, where the issue the issue is not yet, how do we implement this? Where the issue is, what should we do? There is a stylized view of the appropriate role of the military in policy debates, which is, I'll call it an instrumental view, where the military is asked for its views on the feasibility of different courses of action. And typically the answer will be something like, well, in principle, Mr. President, if you want us to do X, here's what it's going to take to do X. And here are the risks of doing X, and also the potential benefits of if all goes well. But you have to understand there's an appreciable chance that all may not go well. And so let's put that alongside other ways of dealing with the problem. That's in principle. In practice, and I think Vince Brooks alluded to this, it's a lot more complicated than that. And military advice to civilians up to the president isn't simply an instrumental advice. How can we do X and what is it going to cost? But is also much more substantive than that. In addition, the military services, frequently one by one, develop special relationships, especially with the Congress of the United States, especially with chairs and ranking members of the relevant committees of jurisdiction, et cetera. So the military, I think one would argue, is more involved in the policy discussion, the substance, than the simple stylized view might suggest. So first to you, Corey. What's your conception of the appropriate role of the military in policy debates? And do you think that what's going on right now is consistent with your view of what ought to be going on?
So it's important to remember that the president and the executive branch are not the only civilian control of the American military. The Congress also serves that role importantly, right? When you go up to testify before armed services, you look at a great big plaque that reads, "It is the responsibility of the Congress to raise armies and maintain navies." And any flag officer 2-star and above who goes up for confirmation has to put their hand over their heart and promise the Congress that if they ever disagree with the policy of the President of the United States, that they will come up to Congress and let the Congress know that. And so, as with everything else about the structure of the American government, there are built-in checks and balances and competing centers of authority. So it's right and proper for the military to keep the Congress informed about what they think, to seek congressional approval for a lot of things that they want. The Secretary of Defense administers defense policy. The Armed Services Committees and the Appropriations Committees really run American defense policy. And so the first thing I would say is that it's really important not to push to the back congressional responsibilities for civilian control of the military. The second thing I would say picks up on something Vince said in his opening remarks, which is that civil-military relations work best, in my experience, as somebody who had to do defense policy during the end of the Cold War, the 91 Iraq War, the invasion of Afghanistan, the 2003 Iraq War, is that military planning works best when the civilian and the military are woven together. It works worst when the White House in a panic says, "Give me military options," or is hesitant to make clear what the end state they are seeking to achieve is, and they just want the military to give them something to do. So if you think about President Obama with Iran policy, for example, He wanted the threat that the United States would be willing to attack the Iranian nuclear program, but he would not give political guidance that allowed the development of military plans to that end because it made him nervous that it would be too provocative. On the other end of the scale, President Trump wanted military plans for a preventative strike on the North Korean nuclear program that were totally unconstrained either by presumed outcomes or anything other than a military input to the plan. Military actions, military operations are only successful if they're embedded in a broader set of political, economic, diplomatic, and other activities. And so, as Vince said, presidents who do it well do it by being clear about what they're trying to achieve and having a military plan that's a piece of, that's embedded in other activities to achieve that. I think at the moment in Ukraine, I mean, the president's been very clear about his main objective, which is no American military involvement in the defense of Ukraine. And he's been very clear about the outcome that he wants, which is American military involvement in the defense of NATO treaty allies. And that helps facilitate all of the military planning. You can agree or disagree with those policy choices by the president, but he's actually served the planning system well by giving clear guidance in public and in private that allows everybody to do their jobs in their lane.
Vince, what do you, I know you've already broached this topic. What's your view of the appropriate kinds of advice that the military should be offering in its appropriate role in important policy debates?
Well, thanks, Bill. And Corey, I certainly align my thoughts with many of yours. So I particularly appreciate how you open with "Don't forget the Congress." I completely agree with that. I recall at my confirmation hearing for commanding U.S. Forces Korea, I sat down with the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, Senator John McCain at the time. He says, "Now, General, there's two kinds of generals. There's those who say they're going to give their unfettered advice to the Congress, even if it disagrees with the president, and those who actually do. It's up to you to determine which kind you want." And he reminded me that the Congress and the president are best served when they're given candid, unfettered advice. Interestingly, a matter of days later, I was sitting with President Obama, who was appointing me to the position. And he said the same thing in the Oval Office. He said, it's critically important that you give unfettered, candid advice. The president is best served with that. And so it was extraordinary to me that while there was certainly political challenge between the two of them, they had the exact same perspective on what military advice should do and be. Unfettered, candid. Now that's not easy to do, honestly. It's not easy to lay out your positions within the executive branch, have decisions made on things like the president's budget as one example. And that's a collective decision by a person who's authorized to make the decision on what that president's budget is going to be. Then go to the Hill and get asked, did you get everything you wanted? Well, no, I didn't get everything. Well, what did you not get? And if the sacred trust is in place, and the Congress is really trying to find out the rest of the story so they can properly resource the military forces, that's good. But if it's give me one or two more bullets so that I can shoot at the president, it's a breach of sacred trust. And I would tell you that's happening all too much at the present time. When we have senior military leaders going in to provide the necessary and appropriate testimony to oversight committees and committees of record, as you talked about, it can't be theater. And if it is, I mean, humans are going to get in there. So is it okay for the military to defend itself when you have someone who's engaging in theater in Congress? Isn't their prerogative to engage in theater? Well, these are questions that the electorate has to decide, but it does have an impact on this approach to civil military relations. To get back to the point on the nature of military advice, I again ascribe to a constructive collaboration, and Corey alluded to this also. It's best when there's a continuous engagement, and that means bringing out ideas, debating them, incorporating different perspectives. You know, sometimes some of the best perspectives that we had on war on terrorism policy came from state and from justice and from Treasury. I was at the time the coordinator for the war on terrorism in the Joint Staff. It's important to take in other perspectives. We get a much better view when we have harnessed what has been called by some as the wisdom of the crowd.
Mm-hmm.
But when we lack that, when we exclude that, or if we want it sequential, I'll give you the policy and you tell me the implementation plan, it's fundamentally flawed because we haven't really thought well enough about it. I think Corey made another very important point about sometimes the immediacy of give me something that I can do now. Sadly, that happens more often than not. And as I talk to military leaders about military advice, I share with them that you have to get used to the reality that what we think will be strategic at the strategic level is not. It is fundamentally tactical thinking at the strategic level. Give me something that I can do now. I need some options that we have to go into action here within the next few days. I've got to send a message. What can I do now? As opposed to what is the long-term view of changing the geopolitical dynamics that have just unfolded before us? Where do we want to be in 5, 6, 10 years? And what actions will put us there in the present? We are where we want to be potentially in the future. That's a very different approach to thinking. One former member of Congress sat down with me when I was in the Joint Staff. I'll just share this as an anecdote. He sat down with me, and again, I was in the Joint Staff and Plans and Policy at the time, myself and one of my lead planners. And he says, you realize that the only place that there can be continuity of strategic thought in the US government is right here in the Pentagon. I went, surely that can't be true. He says, no, it is true. And military has to take on that role. Well, that was a different view than most were sharing at that point in time, but it's certainly a perspective that is worthy of consideration. Is that true? And if it is, how do we appropriately govern and empower the military to provide that kind of long-term continuity advice and still be subject to the immediacy of political necessity and urgent international needs as they unfold? And this is a balance. The last point I'd make on this, Bill, is I think it's really important when you have a crisis situation or something that you're providing a lot of forethought to, and you're looking for how the military instrument fits in, you want the best and most seasoned advice you can get. And so how we raise our military leaders to be able to think through complexities and not just through the simplicities, if you will, of purely military technical instrumental actions as you described it. We have to have senior military leaders who can think broadly about implications, can think about how to create leverage for other instruments of national power, can think about concert of bringing them together, harmony of different approaches as well. That's a very important part of our defense leadership preparation. Can we ever get to that also in generating our civilian leadership to understand the instrumentalities the same way? And I do worry about that. I don't see a mechanism by which that happens.
Well, having been in the White House myself, I certainly appreciate the point you're making about where the repository of long-term thinking is to be found. Whether or not we want it to be that way, whether or not the Constitution contemplated that is a different question, but as a matter of reality, I agree with you completely. I do have a follow-up question for you, which I'd also like Joe to take a swing at. And this is a form of advice giving that I've noticed a lot and which raises some questions in my mind. I don't need to tell you or anybody on this panel, or I suspect anybody listening and watching this panel, that the Department of Defense is made up of a lot of different branches. of the armed forces. And those different branches have somewhat different interests, which don't always align perfectly, particularly when issues of annual appropriations arise or weapon systems arise. And I have noticed that leaders of the different branches of the armed forces often create special relationships with sympathetic members of Congress in order to be able to have a friend in court for their particular view of what the next generation of weapons should be, et cetera, et cetera. Do you think that's basically okay? Or should there be an effort to exert more central control over what representatives of the different services say to members of Congress?
Well, there's a twofold response here, but I think first it is appropriate for each service to have relationships with the different members of the committees are oriented on different things that are more relevant to different services. And having leaders who are savvy, able to communicate across the Potomac River carefully, thoughtfully, that's appropriate. That can serve Congress well and then serve the nation well. At the same time, I do have some concern and some reservation that, in my experience, thanks to the Goldwater-Nichols Act or the Defense Reorganization Act of 1986, there is now only one theater in the world where we fight as services, and it's Washington. The rest of the world, we operate jointly. What we look for, how we prioritize, where the integrated priority lists come from, how we war plan, how we conduct operations is done jointly. And the synergy that comes from that, relationship-wise and functionally, leaves us in a very different place than where we were prior to the reorganization, without a doubt. And I was obviously on both sides of that inflection point. But in Washington, we still fight as services. That's the fault of the Congress, because it's the Congress that seeks input from the services directly. I believe that's a problem. I think it leaves us in the wrong place and is not reflective of the current operational art or the strategic art. And it was their own doing to create the Defense Reorganization Act. I give great credit to them for that. But implementation at the present time is still by services, and services are pitted against one another inappropriately to try to create outcomes. That's a rice bowl fight that causes me to want to be as close to Washington as I can be by living in Austin, Texas. It's a problem. We've got to get beyond that.
I spent 10 years in Austin, by the way. I hope you're enjoying it as much as I did. Joe, over to you. What's your take, particularly on the question that I just addressed to Vince?
There's definitely a place for services to be able to, in my view, have transparency with committees across the Potomac, with armed services and appropriators, and be able to provide pertinent information, as they're putting legislation forward. I think, as brought up earlier by General Brooks, the one thing, and I, as a legislative liaison on the headquarters air staff for 3 years, wearing a suit instead of a uniform, was over there quite often. And it was with a legislative strategy at hand about how to approach one congressman versus another, versus one delegation against another. What might be in the president's budget that, from a leadership standpoint, may not be what was required originally in the submission of the president's budget from our service as a force provider to a combatant commander. And it was extremely difficult navigating through when questions are brought to the service from, whether it's a member, and it's typically a professional staff member. These are career staff members on each of the committees. How do you support the president's budget while at the same time, from a service perspective, somewhat standing up, if you will, for what your particular service is looking for? And that created problems. It absolutely did. And I do think that's something that over the course of time, I hope will change, but I don't think it will. I think you will have members of Congress and staffs who will always want complete access to a service. They want it unfiltered, unfettered, so that what they're bringing forward is most representative of the information they've gathered, and not what just the executive branch has told them, this is what we need, and please go off and put this in appropriation and authorize it. But there is from a service standpoint, in policy for shaping what the eventual budget will be, and making sure that there's information shared on what hopefully staff members are looking at for big acquisition programs. And I would also say that there are several times when services bring forward what should happen with respect to whether it's force size, inventories on whether it's aircraft, tanks, so on and so forth. And you, as a service, you simply don't want to spend that much money in that particular area because it is just too expensive and you need to move in a different direction. But you can't get there because you can't retire that many aircraft, because that will affect 2 or 3 different states, and those particular delegations will never let that get through in an authorization and appropriation. So it's very difficult to navigate through. But I don't think that's going to change anytime soon.
Nope. Well, I've heard it said that the most strategic military decision is how to distribute production of weapon systems among the states and localities to maximize political support for them. But let's not go there. I'm going now to shift gears completely for the last question I'll address to the panel before we go to the audience questions, which are piling up. And Joe, I'm going to stick with you to answer this question first, because I know it's something that you've given a great deal of thought to. I can testify from my time of service at the height of the Vietnam era, and as protests were mobilizing against the Vietnam War around the country, that what happens in American society is going to end up in the US military, because the military draws so broadly on American society, young people, but not just young people. The problems that we discuss in a civilian context will have to be dealt with in a military context as well. So here's the question I want to pose. And it's in 2 parts. Number one, the military has been seen correctly, I think, as an important vehicle of upward mobility and inclusion for groups that haven't always been given a fair shake in civilian society. And so, I'll state this and then move on to the second part of my question. How is the military doing in fulfilling that very important role? Second part, we have all sorts of difficult social problems, sexual harassment, issues raised by gender identity, questions of gender equality, the appropriate role of women in different parts of society, including combat roles in the military. Some people charge that the military has become too, quote unquote, woke. Some people are troubled by the minority of active duty personnel and also of veterans who are attracted by the voices of extremism in our society, some of whom ended up doing not very good things on January 6th, et cetera. So how are we doing? How's the military doing in your judgment as a vehicle of upward mobility and inclusion? And how is it doing in dealing with the problems of the larger society that inevitably show up in military affairs as well?
Great question, and thanks for walking through that, Bill. First, I think the military is doing great as it relates to upward mobility. Just going back to my time from the very late 80s, early 90s, using a couple of examples in real time, living them in squadron life. There were no roles for women in combat at the time. There were absolutely no women in my squadron. And that over the course of 2 or 3 years actually changed. Ended up having females flying side by side. That by all means was a great sign for upward mobility. Same thing for gays in the military. There were members in my squadron who were gay, and the progression of the policies that the Department of Defense had over the course of time to actually get beyond don't ask, don't tell, so on and so forth. I think that's another indication of just how well the military has done in upward mobility. I understand the same issues of the last 5 or 10 years, but I think the military has handled those just like it has over the course of the last 100 years with great progress. I think there have been great opportunities along the way for several different members of our society to be able to participate and have wonderful opportunities for upward mobility. And one of the things that I think that, and it's probably what the service I was in, the Air Force, quite honestly, was and still is about the most diverse. We had several minority groups represented from my early part of my career. And so my experience in seeing that throughout my 22 years is probably much different than that from the Army, the Marine Corps, in some respects, the Navy. And to this day is the most diverse. So I think the military's done very well in upward mobility is the bottom line. The second part of your question, and definitely the issues around January 6th, which I watched from my office across the street at the Library of Congress, and it was awful to watch. Very disturbing that about 10%, of those who were actually cited and charges brought against are former military, and that is just, and in some cases, a couple that are still active. That's troubling, and how that happens is something that I think social media has played a great part in being able to embolden parts of our society that feel that they can come together and share common views, even though I think they're extremely rare. But obviously that plays out in circumstances like you saw on January 6th. Social media itself, today, when we have folks who are going to basic training, they have a cell phone. And depending on what service, they can actually have their cell phone while they're at boot camp. I remember the days when first going on active duty, the closest access I had to family was a payphone at the officers club on the other side of base, and staying in touch with anybody was a challenge. And quite frankly, you were cut off from society, if you will, for a period of time. Now that's just a completely different ballgame. You have recruits who are able to be on social media. And I think a lot of that causes many of the problems that we have today. But at the same time, it does provide an avenue to leadership to be able to communicate quite easily. So that's definitely something that I feel is a problem, at least from my perspective. I'm not quite sure how to directly address that.
Well, I'm absolutely fascinated, Joe, to learn about the diversity of the Air Force, because I can tell you, back in my day, which was more than 50 years ago, we always thought of the Air Force as, 6'2" white guys. I'll grant you that we Marines had a bit of a chip on our shoulders, but the idea that the Air Force is now very diverse, and if you're right, the most diverse, is really quite stunning. Okay, Corey, over to you. Same question. Upward mobility, social problems in the military.
The military's done an outstanding job on upward mobility. And in the surveys of public attitudes that Jim Mattis and I commissioned when we were writing our book, Warriors and Citizens, it's one of the top reasons that Americans have such affection for their military. They understand that it is a conveyor belt into the middle class, that it gives people skills, it gives them self-discipline, self-respect, and opportunities that very few institutions in American public life continue to give. Let me just give one example. My own alma mater, Stanford University, 20% of Stanford's admissions are legacy admissions. So even in higher education, which is another of the important conveyor belts into the middle class and upward mobility, the system is silting up in some ways. And that's actually not true of the American military. And it's something the public very much likes and admires about its military. Second thing I would say is that the American military has every single problem we have in American society, because they are a microcosm of our society. And while it's true that less than 0.5% of Americans are in military service, that's only partly the result of who volunteers. It's also the result of a policy choice that we only need a small military relative to our population. And we should be celebrating that fact, that we can be secure with such a small proportion of our public in military service. It's a policy choice. It's something to be celebrated. And that we remain a military broadly representative of American society, even in that circumstance, is again cause for celebration. It is true that roughly 10% of the people who have been charged, of the 700 and some people who have been charged for their involvement in the January 6th insurrection that attempted to prevent the peaceful transition of power in our country, roughly 10% of them are veterans. Which is roughly the incidence of male veterans in the American population. So it is not a disproportionate number of insurrectionists that are veterans. It's almost straight down the line with their existence in the broader population. That's actually not the thing to worry about radicalization in the American military. The two things that we should be much more worried about are, first of all, the military doesn't actually know whether it has a radicalization problem in its ranks, because it hasn't attempted to identify and track the indicators of it. And largely they have declined to do that because of congressional opposition. And so one way that Congress could very constructively look into and prevent the emergence of this kind of political activism in our ranks is not just to have the military discourage it, which it currently does, but to have Congress give the military the tools, like requiring information that will allow them to understand whether they have a problem in the ranks, which they currently do not know. And the second thing to be worried about is that it does not look like extremist groups cultivate military or veteran participation in order to gain tactical skills. You can get those in lots of other places. What they do, as the work Michael Robinson and I published in the New York Times and in Orbis a couple of months ago, shows, is that they are recruiting active duty military, they're recruiting veterans in order to tap into the legitimacy that the public will accord to military involvement. That is, they are trying to harness extreme and politically violent activity to associations with the military in order to make it more acceptable to the broad American public. And that is a real danger.
Vince, over to you. You have a unique perspective on all of this, given your career in the military, which stretched over the better part of 4 decades. So upward mobility and social problems. How's the military doing?
Well, I thank Joe and Corey for their insights, excellent insights from both of you. Let me just add to your thoughts a few observations. Of course, this has been my world for my entire life. I'm the son of a career Army officer, brother of a career Army officer, and son-in-law of a career Army officer. And me, I'm just a laggard trying to keep up with the others. But the reality is there are really 2 different dynamics of upward mobility that need to be contemplated. There's upward mobility within society as a result of military service, and there's upward mobility within the military. And I think that those are 2 different dynamics to be measured sociologically, and 2 different dynamics to be recognized in terms of where the friction points are and how well the military is doing. There is clearly much to be proud of in the U.S. military. It's still an exemplar in society, without a doubt, on these matters, whether it's the social issues or the upward mobility issues to your question. At the same time, there are still clear indications that we are not where we need to be and where we want to be, I would submit to you. Leadership matters in this. So it's national leadership that begins first in setting the tone of what is important to us in America. If the leadership in America says that thinking about these matters is a matter of being woke, then it's going to create a sentiment that such matters are not important, that only one perspective is important, and that conformity and compliance will be important. That hinders upward mobility, that hinders a sense of inclusion. If there's a sense that this is important to us, that we want to be representative of our full society, and that things that hinder that are hindrances to us being the best America we can and having the best military we can to serve it. That too is a function of leadership. When the military is given a directive related to these spirits of America, how we really want to be, then the military goes into implementation on it, because there's no place that has a stronger structure of leadership than the United States military. And so I witnessed many changes like that in my career. And if I add my father's career on that, everything from desegregation to the inclusion of women in combat roles, the transgender and LGBT dimensions of the force, I've witnessed all of that. And I can tell you that there's always an inflection point, 2 sides of it. There's the policy inflection point that says we now are going to be different than we were yesterday. Desegregation, et cetera, each one of these. And then there's the reality inflection point that comes much later in terms of how the culture changes within the military. And that culture can be inconsistent with society's culture at a given point in time. So I was living in integrated installations in the US military in the 1960s. And society around me wasn't that same way. And so in some cases, it was strange to leave the military installation and feel the same sort of segregation, the same sort of oppression that my parents had talked about and my grandparents talked about. And particularly in those years that I lived in Virginia, which was not an exemplar of racial harmony and inclusion, certainly at the time. I guess my point here is we should not rest on our laurels by seeing that there has been progress. We should look for the specific things that are still hindrances to being what it is we really want to be. Are we reflective of society? We start with the numbers. The answer is no. And particularly as you go further and further up the ranks. Sergeants like Bill, yes, we're very close to that representation proportionally. 4-star generals like Vince, no, we're not. Nowhere close to it. And it's interesting to try to dig into what are the social dynamics that cause the decisions to be made on providing upward mobility or depriving it. I'll give you one anecdote here. I recall in 1990, I was up at the Military Academy at West Point speaking. That was 10 years after my graduation. And it was also 10 years after the first year that included women in the graduating class. My class, I'm very proud to be part of that class in 1980. In the year 1990, West Point graduated its 1,000th woman. That's pretty impressive in 10 years' time. And believe me, they are the cream of the crop of America. Absolutely. They were and they are. It's just unbelievable, the talent that comes through those doors in female form. But interestingly, in the very same year, we graduated the 1,000th African American. And that was after entry into the military academy in the early 1870s. So more than 110 years had elapsed to get to 1,000 African American graduates. Most of those since 1936. Why is that? And so I think that looking deeper into the dynamics of mobility, upward mobility, societally and militarily, we can find that there are still things that hinder us being the full representation of our society. And certainly that applies now to other issues. I guess my last point I'll make on this is my experience has been the more we get out of the way from a policy perspective, the more we are surprised at how well those that we were presuming not to be capable actually perform. So women are performing superbly in combat roles. And they're doing amazing things out there defending our nation. And they're working superbly within teams. And the men in those teams also are working superbly beside them. Some may have reservation, and those are aberrant and have to be recognized as such and be given the chance to understand why it's important for both of them to be on the team. That's what leadership is all about. The more we get out of the way, the better we recognize that achievement can occur from any one of these categories without artificial limitations or boundaries. The more we try to control it, the worse it gets, without a doubt. The rules that get imposed, adjustments of standards, all these sorts of things to try to force inclusion will not get us where we need to be. What we have to do is be deliberate about developing a talent from America's population that can rise. Should we also look on the outside and see whether those who come out of military service, who are of the diverse categories of our society, have success at the same rates in society as their majority counterparts? The answer is no, not yet. Not yet. We're not there yet. So we have to keep going, not give up, not be dissuaded by accusations of being woke. This is what America is, and I think it's worth America's future to try to make room for this to happen. It doesn't make us weaker militarily. It makes us actually the envy of the world.
Thanks so much. We're now into the final segment of this panel. And I've gotten a lot of questions from the audience, but I can wrap most of those questions into one big bundle. If we have time, I'll deal with a second bundle of questions. If we don't, this will be our exit question. A lot of the members of the audience, notwithstanding the difficulties, Vince, that you've pointed to, and that Joe pointed to, Corey has pointed to, do see the military as one of the more successful institutions in our society. And if I can step out of my moderator's role for just a minute, based on my experience encountering the military at the Brookings Institution, I absolutely agree with that. Right? The quality of the leadership, the military leadership that I've encountered, whether at the 4-star level, or, future brigade commanders, has been extraordinary. And if other institutions in our society were training their leaders as well as the military is training its leaders, I have to believe we'd be in better shape. So here are the questions from the audience that seem to me to reflect this understanding. And I'll just read a couple of omnibus questions. One of them is as follows: what lessons on race relations does the military have for the larger society? where these relations seem to be getting only more fraught over time. And the second part of this omnibus question, is there anything practical that the military does that would be applicable to other parts of society, schools in particular, to enhance their standing and effectiveness in molding constructive behavior? Corey, let's start with you.
Yeah, I love this question because I went to work in a military staff when I was still a PhD student. And I didn't know much about the American military when I went to work in Colin Powell's Joint Staff. And what I learned is that mostly what the American military are great teachers, because they live in an environment where you can't be good at your job unless you can make everyone around you good at their job.
Mhm.
And the institution takes that undertaking incredibly seriously. You know, the military services array their institutional resources to identify people capable of doing what needs doing, to give them the education and the training to succeed at that, to promote them on the basis of future potential, not just past performance, and to manage out of the organization people who are not prime contributors over time. And when I went to work in the policy planning staff at the State Department 20 years later, I was shocked at how much better the talent pool is in the State Department than in the military, and how much worse the performance of the institution is in the State Department than in the Pentagon, because they don't invest in the institutional resources, setting people up to be successful at the core of the profession. And the military does that incredibly well because they understand that they can't succeed without it. And other institutions, the State Department in particular, believes that they hire people with all of the skills they need to be successful in that environment. And it's manifestly untrue. So education matters, training matters. What matters most of all is institutional commitment to set people up to be successful. And that parenthetically is also what has made the American military good at challenges like racial integration. They flooded the entry-level ranks. And so as people like Vince Brooks perked up through the institution, there was no question that they were the peer of their peers, and not so as Colin Powell very often used to say, he was, of course, the product of affirmative action in the Army. And he was also better than everybody else of his generation. Both of those things can be true. And the way the military has handled many of the integration and mainstreaming challenges institutionally has been to prove that.
Joe, what's your take on these questions?
One of the points that Corey just brought up that I think is really important, and that the military really does look at your potential to serve in the next grade. Yes, your experiences and what you have accomplished in the past are things considered as you go through the promotion ranks, but at the end of the day, you're promoted based on your ability to perform in the next grade. It's based on several different factors, and training all the different types of opportunities available, but quite honestly, what is expected. Education and training expected of all of our military members, I think plays a huge part in why the armed forces are looked at as some of the folks that submitted questions here and are wondering why there's such a difference between the military when compared to other parts of the rest of the government, as an example. And I do think that there's such an investment in professional development from the very, very early stages when you first come into the military, throughout your entire career, and there's expectations along the way. It is continuous improvement. It is constant learning. It is looking back in history from lessons learned and applying those consistently over the course of time. And I just think that that really does help grow and mature a talented workforce that at the end of the day, so there is such an investment that's exactly why right now the military, in my view, does have, when compared to other parts of the government, there's just a big difference there. Now, I will say, I think it's unfair, however, to say that there aren't other parts of the federal government that do very well at this. And I'll give you a direct example. I spent 3 years at the Department of Homeland Security. And there are absolute agencies that invest an enormous amount of time in training, development, et cetera. And they're also extremely important to the success of our nation, whether you're talking Homeland Security investigations, whether you're talking about those who are working on very serious matters with respect to our border. There are very similar programs that are at agencies just like in the armed forces. And so I just want to share that as for everybody who is listening today, it's not just the armed forces. There are definitely other places where I feel that there is just as much of an investment in those who are part of the agency or armed forces in our case here.
Vince Brooks, I think you're going to get the last word, not only on this question, but in this panel. So I'd like you to wrestle on what I think is the toughest part of these questions from the audience. Taking on board Joe's point that there are other agencies in the government that do quite a good job of education, training, and professional development, I think the members of the audience are also concerned about the broader question of whether there are things that the military is doing right that might conceivably be translated into different ways of doing business in civilian, non-governmental social institutions, schools, and other parts of our society. I know it's a tough question, but I think you're up to it. So what do you think?
All right, thanks, Bill. I'm honored to be able to close this out here. It really connects to the previous questions that Corey and Joe both responded to. And I would say that the military is the same society as the broader society beyond it, but it's a different culture. So the difference is there. And I think that is the origin of where the recognition that it's performing differently as an institution, where the trust comes from. What are the things that are inside of that might be valuable to the rest of society? Well, I'll just articulate them. It's clearly up to someone else to figure out how to create the instrumentalities that cause such things to be more prevalent in the broader society. But the military is a culture that applies responsibility, individual responsibility, and couples it with accountability. You're responsible for certain actions. You're responsible for complying with regulations. You're responsible for being on time every day. You're responsible for doing the right thing. You're responsible for implementing policies that have been placed upon the service. And there's accountability for it, and a system of accountability. You're expected, an expectation of a problem if you have chosen to deviate from the requirement of you as a unique citizen, a citizen in uniform. Are those things that could be transported? Sure. Responsibility, the responsibility of every citizen, the responsibility to keep the nation strong, the accountability toward these things. That's not just living under the law, but it's how we operate with one another in society. This idea of an expectation of collective success. That's the heart of the military. It's the ultimate team of teams, collective success. If you are able to be a great machine gunner but you don't have an ammo bearer laying down beside you, you're not going to shoot for very long, no matter how well you shoot. And it starts at that lowest level and goes all the way up to the highest levels. That collective success is what is valued, not individual achievement. Even if there are 4 decades of achievement and many, many stars, none of that matters without the collective achievements that happen along the way. It's for those who reflect on it this way, it's about receiving another chance to have a larger set of collective achievements in a greater body. So the spirit of collective achievement, teamwork, is certainly something that can be passed over into society in other ways. Selfless service to the nation is a spirit that is part of this culture of the military. Wouldn't that be wonderful if everyone had a sense of selfless service to the nation on the outside? Now, I don't want to be one of those who says the military is better than society. The military is society. It just operates in a different culture. And to the extent that those cultural conditions can be exported into society or picked up by society in a fuller way, I think that's a good thing. I don't want this to sound like a conservative versus progressive idea. It's not. This is without regard to political ideation. This is about societal ideation. How do we feel about what our society is to be? This is where I think the root of the trust comes from. And I believe that it's something that's worthwhile. I would comment last point here on programs like Junior ROTC, the Junior Reserve Officer Training Corps program. Now, while it doesn't directly translate into military service, it does translate into much higher success rates in graduating from high school. It does translate into a greater sense of social responsibility. In some cases, it also translates into military service. But programs like that emphasize things like citizenship, collective responsibility, accountability to one another, that's beneficial, and it's factual. This is not something I'm supposing. This is absolutely factual. How can our society do these sorts of things? Is there a need for a national system of compulsory service? Not the military draft that we knew about once upon a time, but national service in some other way that is serving the nation under a collective structure that the government provides. The National Highway Service, the National Postal Service, the National Rail Service, the National Cosmetic Service. I don't care what it is, but to the extent that something that can be created that says you are a citizen of the United States, either by birth or by naturalization, and you have an obligation to help make this nation better. That's an idea that builds a sense of collective responsibility for one another. I would just offer those as some thoughts here, and just feel very fortunate that I had the privilege of serving in the military and experiencing that firsthand.
Well, just speaking for myself, but I suspect not only for myself, individual responsibility, accountability, teamwork, and service to something larger than yourself, that is a pretty darn good description, in my view, of the national rejuvenation we need. As one of a small band of people who helped design the AmeriCorps program in the early 1990s, you've certainly rung a chord in me with the idea of service in various capacities of our society, civilian as well as military. Well, let me, on behalf of the Library of Congress, the American Enterprise Institution, and and my own institution, Brookings, I want to express our deep collective appreciation to Joe, to Corey, to Vince, for giving up an hour and a half of their time and sharing not only their knowledge, but also their wisdom with us. And I've come away from this panel a little bit less despairing about the current state of American society and our future for national renewal. I think we have it within ourselves to do that. And this panel discussion has given us a good basis for the broader social and national conversation that we need. So thank you all very much.